The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Maplewood Park, filtering through the swaying branches of towering oak trees. The air was warm and filled with the soft sounds of children laughing, joggers pacing along the winding trail, and the distant hum of city life beyond the park's borders. The serenity of the moment was a rare gift, one that Olivia Carter intended to cherish. She sat on a weathered wooden bench near the pond, her posture relaxed but poised, a thick hardcover book resting in her hands. Reading had always been her escape, a brief respite from the relentless demands of her legal career. As one of Cleveland's most respected civil rights attorneys, Olivia spent her days immersed in cases, advocating for justice, and navigating the often unforgiving landscape of the courtroom. But here, in the quiet of the park, she could breathe. Her eyes scanned the pages, absorbing the carefully crafted words, when suddenly, a sharp screech shattered the peace. The unmistakable sound of car tires skidding against pavement yanked Olivia from her reading. A police cruiser had pulled up abruptly to the curb, its presence immediately drawing the attention of nearby parkgoers. Conversations stilled, joggers slowed their pace. Parents exchanged cautious glances as they watched two uniformed officers step out of the vehicle, their expressions taut with authority. From the moment their eyes locked onto her, Olivia knew something was wrong. She stiffened slightly but remained seated, instinctively schooling her expression into one of calm. Years in the legal profession had taught her the power of composure, even in the face of hostility. The officers, Riley and Jameson, moved toward her with deliberate strides. Though Olivia had no reason to be concerned, she was simply reading in a public park. The tension in their approach sent a ripple of unease down her spine. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" Officer Riley asked, his tone carrying more suspicion than courtesy. Olivia glanced up slowly, her fingers still lightly gripping the edges of her book. She didn't flinch, she didn't panic. Instead, she met their stares head-on, calm and unshaken. "Of course," she replied, carefully closing the book and resting it on her lap. Officer Jameson stepped closer, his stance rigid, his gaze scrutinizing. There was no small talk, no pretense of concern, just a sharp demand. "We received a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" A flicker of confusion crossed Olivia's face, but she kept her voice even. "Suspicious activity?" she repeated, arching an eyebrow. "I'm just sitting here, reading." She held up the book slightly, as if that would somehow clarify the absurdity of the accusation, but their scrutiny didn't waver. "Can we see some ID?" Jameson demanded. Her pulse quickened just slightly, but she didn't let it show. Olivia had represented countless clients who had been through encounters just like this. She had advised people on their rights. She had fought for individuals targeted without cause. And now, here she was, on the other side of the equation. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "What's the reason for this?" "It's routine," Riley replied, though the edge in his tone suggested otherwise. A small crowd had begun to form at a distance, onlookers sensing the imbalance in the interaction. Some watched with curiosity, others with quiet discomfort. Olivia sighed, reaching into her bag to retrieve her wallet. She moved deliberately, ensuring every motion was measured, knowing all too well how easily things could escalate. She handed over her driver's license, watching as Jameson examined it with unnecessary intensity. "Olivia Carter," he read aloud, almost mockingly. His eyes flickered back up to hers. "What's your business here, Miss Carter?" She inhaled deeply, patience, restraint, precision. "I live in this city," she said. "I came here to enjoy the park. Is that a problem?" Jameson's lips tightened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he handed her ID back, yet they didn't walk away. The questioning continued, and Olivia felt the shift. This wasn't routine. This wasn't about safety or law enforcement. This was an interrogation. "Do you always carry a book like that around?" Riley asked, his voice laced with something unspoken. "Are you alone here, or are you waiting for someone?" Jameson added, his hand resting on his belt. A calculated move. Olivia had spent years arguing cases in courtrooms, handling intense cross-examinations, and pushing back against aggressive prosecution. But this was different. This was personal. "I'm not answering any more questions," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "Unless you tell me what I'm being accused of." A beat of silence. Then, something shifted in the officer's posture. Jameson stepped forward abruptly. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job." Her jaw tightened. "I know the law," Olivia replied, her voice steady. "And I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." But reason wasn't on their agenda. Without warning, Jameson reached for her arm. "You're resisting," he declared. "What are you doing?" Olivia exclaimed, startled. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Someone pulled out their phone, pressing record. "Stop resisting," Jameson repeated, louder this time. A performance. Cold metal snapped around her wrists. Handcuffs. Olivia kept her composure, even as a sharp mix of humiliation and frustration burned in her chest. The officers ignored the growing protests from onlookers as they led her toward their cruiser. As she was forced into the back seat, her eyes locked onto a young woman holding up her phone, recording everything. For a moment, there was an unspoken exchange, a silent plea to document the injustice unfolding. The car door slammed shut. The world outside blurred as the cruiser pulled away. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The cruiser's back seat was cold, the leather stiff beneath Olivia Carter as she sat with her hands bound in metal. The weight of the cuffs dug into her wrists, and with each bump in the road, they pinched tighter against her skin. The officers, Jameson and Riley, said nothing as they drove. The only sounds filling the silence were the crackle of the police radio and the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. Olivia stared out at the passing streetlights, her own reflection staring back at her in the glass. The absurdity of the situation pressed against her chest. She had spent years fighting for justice, standing in courtrooms defending those who had been unfairly targeted, ensuring that the system worked for the people it often tried to silence. And now, she was on the other side of it. She forced herself to stay calm, inhaling deeply as the cruiser pulled into the station. This was just another battle. She had faced worse. But even as she told herself that, she couldn't ignore the fact that this wasn't just about her. How many others had sat in this same seat? How many had been silenced before their stories could be told? The car came to a stop. Jameson opened the door and pulled her out, his grip firm but not rough. "Let's go," he muttered, leading her toward the entrance. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the polished floors as they walked through the station. Inside, officers moved about with practiced ease, some barely sparing her a glance, others offering quick, knowing smirks as if they had seen this play out 100 times before. To them, she was just another arrest. She kept her chin high, her posture straight. They wouldn't break her. "Step over here," an officer instructed as she was led to the booking desk. The process began, one step at a time, each more humiliating than the last. Fingerprints. Her hands were pressed down onto an ink pad, then rolled onto paper, her identity reduced to a series of smudged black lines. Mugshots. The flash of the camera was blindingly harsh, capturing her in a moment she never imagined for herself. Then came the search. Every step of the process was designed to strip away autonomy, dignity, control. And as much as Olivia tried to remain detached, she felt the weight of it settling in her chest. Finally, they led her through a set of iron doors and into a dimly lit holding cell. The space was small and bare, with a cold metal bench attached to the wall. The air smelled of disinfectant and exhaustion, as though the very walls absorbed the desperation of those who had come before her. The door clanged shut behind her. She was alone. She sat down on the bench, her hands still aching from the cuffs, and let her head rest against the wall. This wasn't real, except it was. The system she had defended, the laws she had spent years upholding, now they were being used against her. For the first time that night, her composure cracked. Just a little. She exhaled slowly, pressing her fingertips against her temples, forcing herself to think. This wasn't a wrongful arrest on paper. It was a performance. The officers hadn't been looking for justice. They had been looking for dominance, power, control, and they had chosen the wrong person. Hours passed. She didn't know how long she had been there. Time felt strange in the cell, stretching and twisting into something unrecognizable. At some point, an officer approached the bars, holding a clipboard. "Olivia Carter," he called. She lifted her head, her expression blank. "You've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing an officer," he said, reading from the clipboard in a flat, detached voice. A bitter laugh almost escaped her. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "You can discuss that in court," he replied, just as dismissive as the officers before him. Then he turned and walked away. She let out a slow breath. She had known the charges were coming, but hearing them out loud, spoken with such casual indifference, made them feel heavier. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her mind shifting into strategy mode. This wasn't over. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her name was called again. A guard unlocked the door, motioning for her to stand. "You're being released on bail," he said, leading her toward the processing area. Her body was stiff as she followed, her mind still caught between anger and exhaustion. The moment she stepped past the last set of security doors and into the cool night air, she heard a familiar voice. "Olivia!" She turned just as Maya Thompson rushed toward her, relief and frustration etched across her face. Maya, her best friend and closest colleague, had clearly been waiting for hours. "Are you okay?" Maya asked, scanning Olivia's face, as if searching for any hidden injuries. "I'm fine," Olivia said, but the words felt hollow. Maya folded her arms. "No, you're not." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Maya's expression hardened. "We're fighting this." A slow smile, one without humor, touched Olivia's lips. "Oh, we're doing more than fighting it," she murmured. As they walked to the car, Olivia felt the shift deep inside her. This wasn't just about what had happened tonight. This was about all the times it had happened before. And now she had the tools, the knowledge, and the will to fight back. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The night air was cool and sharp, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the police station. As Olivia Carter and Maya Thompson walked toward the car, neither spoke for a moment. Olivia's wrists still ached from the cuffs, a physical reminder of her humiliation, her violation. Maya unlocked the car, but instead of starting the engine, she turned in her seat, her dark eyes scanning Olivia carefully. "You're quiet," Maya said. "I'm exhausted," Olivia admitted, her voice low. Maya let out a small huff of frustration, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Olivia, I need you to tell me right now that you're not just going to let this go." Silence. Olivia's fingers tightened into fists on her lap. The words were there, forming in the back of her mind, but she wasn't ready to say them out loud. "Because I swear," Maya continued, her voice rising slightly, "if you tell me you just want to move on, that you don't want to make this a fight, I will personally drag you back into that police station and file the lawsuit myself." That pulled a small, dry laugh from Olivia's throat. Maya always knew how to break through her walls. Finally, Olivia turned her head, meeting her best friend's gaze. Her exhaustion was real, but so was something else, something sharper, something that burned beneath her skin. "This isn't just about me," Olivia murmured. Maya nodded, her jaw tight. "Then we fight." The next morning, Olivia sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads and open law books. She had barely slept, her mind too full, her body still humming with residual anger. She picked up her pen, staring at the blank notepad in front of her. Civil rights violation. Carter vs. Cleveland Police Department. The words stared back at her, daring her to make them real. The officers had violated her rights. They had humiliated her in front of dozens of witnesses, arrested her without cause, and then charged her with crimes she didn't commit. And if it had happened to her, a well-respected attorney, how many others had been through the same thing, without a voice, without the means to fight back? She wasn't just filing this lawsuit for herself. She was filing it for all of them. Maya arrived a little after noon, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a determined look. "Tell me you started," Maya said, setting the coffee down and glancing at the legal pad. Olivia smirked. "Of course." Maya exhaled in relief before pulling up a chair. "Good, because you need to see this." She pulled out her phone, tapped a few times, and then turned the screen toward Olivia. The video was shaky, but the scene was unmistakable. Olivia, sitting on the park bench, book in hand, the officers approaching, the interrogation, the way Jameson grabbed her arm, and then, the moment they snapped the cuffs on. Olivia watched in silence, her stomach twisting as she saw herself from the outside. The way the crowd murmured in discomfort, the way people pulled out their phones, knowing something was wrong, The final shot was of her inside the cruiser, staring at the camera, silently asking for the moment to be recorded. Olivia slowly placed the phone down. "It's everywhere," Maya said. "Hundreds of thousands of views already. People are talking, Olivia. They're pissed." The thought sent a shiver through her. Not fear, something else. "What are they saying?" Olivia asked. Maya pulled up the comment section, scrolling. "This happens every day, and finally someone with power is in the same position. Let's see what happens now." She's a lawyer. Imagine if she wasn't. Would she even have made it out? Cleveland PD is about to be in for a hell of a lawsuit. The words hit Olivia harder than she expected. This wasn't just a personal fight anymore. The video had started something bigger. By mid-afternoon, Olivia's phone was flooded with messages. Some were from friends, former clients, and community leaders. Others were from complete strangers, people sharing their own stories. "This happened to my brother last year. I was stopped and searched for no reason just last month. They always do this. Please don't let this go." Olivia read them all one by one, feeling the weight of each story settle onto her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. This was about all of them. She placed her phone down, rubbing her temples. She had work to do. By the end of the day, Maya and Olivia had outlined the lawsuit. It was clear. Director, unlawful arrest, violation of civil rights, abuse of power. They were building something solid, something undeniable. But before they could move forward, Olivia had one more battle to fight. The next morning, she walked into the offices of Carter and Weston, the prestigious law firm where she had built her career. The energy was different. People were watching her, whispering. She barely had time to sit in her office before the managing partner, Michael Weston, called her in. She stepped inside, and the moment she saw his expression, she knew exactly where this conversation was going. "Olivia," he said, lacing his fingers together on his desk, "you know how much we respect your work, but this lawsuit is tricky." She tilted her head. "Tricky?" Weston sighed. "It's getting a lot of attention. And while we absolutely support civil rights cases, we have to consider how this will reflect on the firm." Olivia's jaw tightened. "This is my fight, Michael, not the firm's." "That's the thing," he said carefully. "It's not just your fight anymore. It's everywhere. The firm's name is attached to you, and not everyone is comfortable with the attention this is bringing." She let the silence stretch. She could see it, the hesitation, the desire to pull back, to distance themselves. She had dedicated years of her life to this firm, to justice. And now, when she needed their support the most, they were afraid. Olivia straightened. "I appreciate your concern," she said, her voice sharp, "but let me be clear. I'm not dropping this case, and I won't be quiet about it." Weston exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "You do what you have to do, Olivia," he finally said. "But understand that the firm won't be officially backing you on this." She had expected it, but hearing it still stung. She stood, placing both hands on his desk. Noted. Then she turned and walked out. Her firm might be afraid of the backlash, but she wasn't. She had a case to win. The moment Olivia Carter walked out of Carter and Weston's office, she knew she was on her own. Not in the literal sense. Maya was with her. And there were already hundreds, maybe thousands of people rallying behind her. But her law firm, the place where she had built her career, had chosen neutrality over justice. That was fine, because Olivia wasn't backing down. The next morning, she sat in her home office, staring at the lawsuit draft on her laptop. The evidence she had so far was strong, but she knew it wasn't enough. This couldn't just be about her experience, it had to be bigger. If she wanted real justice, she needed to expose the entire pattern of misconduct. Not just what happened in Maplewood Park, but every injustice officers Jamison and Riley had gotten away with before. Maya, sitting across from her with a fresh cup of coffee, leaned back in her chair. "So, where do we start?" Olivia exhaled. "With the past." They needed to dig deep. Uncovering the pattern. With Maya's help, Olivia assembled a small team of like-minded attorneys, paralegals, and legal interns. People who believed in the case, who believed in change. Together, they started researching. Old complaints, internal affairs reports, excessive force cases, civilian complaints that had been quietly dismissed. It didn't take long before a pattern began to emerge. Jamison and Riley weren't just overzealous officers. They were repeat offenders. Multiple incidents of racial profiling, unlawful detentions, excessive force complaints, some of which had mysteriously vanished from official records. And yet, despite all of it, they were still in uniform, still patrolling the same streets, still targeting people like Olivia. Hearing the voices of the people. As Olivia dug deeper into their histories, she started attending community meetings, listening to the stories of people who had suffered under the same broken system. One night, at a small church in the city, she sat among a crowd of locals who had gathered to discuss police accountability. Some spoke in anger, others in exhaustion, and then a woman stood up. Her hands shook as she clutched a faded photograph. "This is my son, Marcus," she said softly. The room fell silent. He was walking home one night when they stopped him. Jamison and Riley. Olivia felt her breath catch. They said he looked suspicious. He tried to explain he lived just 2 blocks away, but they didn't listen. They threw him against their cruiser, beat him, arrested him. Her voice cracked. And then they charged him with resisting arrest. Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Variations of the same story. Different names, different nights, same officers. Olivia knew then, this wasn't just about her. This was about all of them. The backlash begins. As Olivia prepared to file the lawsuit, the police union struck back. Articles started appearing in local news outlets. Attorney Olivia Carter attempts to discredit local law enforcement. Frivolous lawsuit threatens the integrity of Cleveland's police department. And worse, anonymous sources leaked details about her personal life. Old cases she had worked on were twisted into narratives that painted her as anti-police and dangerous. The smear campaign was clear. They wanted to make her seem biased, reckless, unhinged. Maya slammed her laptop shut one evening, furious. "This is disgusting," she seethed. Olivia, unshaken, leaned back in her chair. "This was expected," she said simply. "They're scared." "That doesn't make it right," Maya snapped. Olivia's eyes hardened. "Number. But it means we're getting close." A city holding its breath. As the lawsuit gained traction, support poured in. Activists, journalists, even other attorneys. Some were hesitant at first, worried about what taking a stand against the police might mean for their careers, their families. But the video of Olivia's arrest had already changed something. People were watching, talking, demanding answers, and the city could feel the tension rising. The legal battle ahead was going to be brutal, but Olivia was ready, because this wasn't just about winning a case. It was about changing the system, and she would fight for herself, for Marcus, for every voice that had been silenced before, no matter what it took. The hum of city life filtered through Olivia Carter's office window as she sat at her desk, poring over the final details of her lawsuit. The weight of everything, the research, the testimonies, the growing public attention pressed against her shoulders, but she thrived under pressure. Her phone buzzed, breaking her focus. She barely glanced at the number before answering. "Olivia Carter." A familiar voice greeted her. Judge Everett, head of judicial assignments. "Olivia, I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, Judge. What can I do for you?" There was a slight pause. "We've got a new case coming in next month, and given your record, I'd like to assign it to you. It's an internal misconduct hearing, 2 officers accused of excessive force." Olivia leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temple. Misconduct cases were always difficult. Police departments did everything they could to protect their own, and internal hearings were often little more than formalities before officers were quietly cleared. Still, if it meant holding law enforcement accountable, she was in. "I'd be honored to take the case," she said. Another pause. Judge Everett exhaled, his voice shifting. "I thought you should know. The officers in question are Jamison and Riley." Silence. Olivia's grip on the phone tightened. She sat up straight, her heartbeat suddenly too loud in her ears. "Jamison and Riley?" she repeated, as if saying their names would make it less surreal. "The very same," Everett confirmed. an excessive force complaint in an unrelated case. The details will be forwarded to you, but I wanted to call personally because I understand this might be a conflict of interest for you. Conflict of interest. That was an understatement. These were the same officers who had humiliated her, arrested her without cause, left bruises on her wrists. The same officers she was suing. Now, she was being asked to sit on the bench and judge them. Olivia? Everett's voice cut through her thoughts. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. I appreciate the call, Judge. Can I have a day to consider? Of course. Let me know by tomorrow. The line went dead. Olivia set the phone down and stared at nothing. The irony was almost too much to process. She had been fighting tooth and nail for accountability, pushing against the very system that protected men like Jameson and Riley. And now, that same system had placed the gavel in her hand. A slow, unsteady exhale left her lips. This wasn't just a case. This was something bigger. This could be your chance. Maya arrived at Olivia's apartment an hour later, barely waiting for the door to open before stepping inside. You have to take it, she said immediately, dropping her bag onto the couch. Olivia folded her arms, watching her friend pace. You don't think it's a conflict of interest? Maya scoffed. Olivia, this entire system is built on conflicts of interest. Do you think if the roles were reversed, if they had a say in your case, they'd recuse themselves? Olivia remained silent. They'd take the win, Maya continued. And you should too. Olivia ran a hand over her face, exhaustion mixing with uncertainty. Even if I take the case, I have to be impartial, she said. I can't let my emotions dictate my ruling. Maya nodded. I know, and I also know that if anyone can be impartial, it's you. That's why this is happening, Olivia. Because you know what real justice is supposed to look like. Olivia sank onto the couch, shaking her head. This is surreal. Maya sat beside her. Yeah, she agreed. But it's also poetic. These guys are about to face a judge who actually believes in accountability. For once, they won't be able to manipulate the system in their favor. Olivia exhaled, her mind racing. She had spent weeks preparing to fight them in court, and now the law was giving her another path, a chance to show them what justice really meant. She looked at Maya, her decision solidifying. I'm taking the case. Maya grinned. Good, let's make history. The weight of the gavel. The next morning, Olivia called Judge Everett. I'll take the case. The assignment was finalized within hours. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Olivia kept her focus, reading every page of the misconduct reports, analyzing past cases, preparing to step into the courtroom. The case against Jameson and Riley was disturbingly similar to her own experience. A young man named Ethan Parker had been stopped for a minor traffic violation. What should have been a routine stop escalated when the officers pulled him from his vehicle, forced him to the ground, and arrested him, despite no evidence of resistance. There were witnesses, video evidence, complaints filed, and yet, without this hearing, these men would still be in uniform. As the hearing date approached, Olivia reaffirmed one thing to herself. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for justice. She was here to prove that the system could work, if the right people were holding the gavel, and she was about to make sure Jameson and Riley finally faced the consequences they had spent years avoiding. The courtroom was buzzing with tension. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters, activists, community members, and even other attorneys had gathered to witness what was already shaping up to be one of the most talked about hearings in Cleveland. It wasn't just another police misconduct case. It was a reckoning. At the defense table, officers Jameson and Riley sat stiffly in their uniforms, flanked by their attorney. They kept their heads high, but there was a rigidness in their posture, a quiet unease that hadn't been there in previous hearings, where they had walked in with smug confidence. They had no idea what was coming. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the bailiff's voice rang out. All rise. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Carter presiding. The room fell into silence. Jameson and Riley turned their heads toward the bench. The moment Olivia Carter stepped into view, black robe flowing, a gavel in hand, the air changed. The officers froze. Jameson's face drained of color, his eyes widening slightly as he processed what he was seeing. Riley's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The sheer shock written across their faces spoke louder than words. Olivia took her seat behind the bench, her expression calm and unreadable. She allowed the weight of the moment to settle over the room. This wasn't about personal vengeance. This wasn't about retaliation. This was about justice. "Be seated," she said, her voice steady and firm. Everyone obeyed, the rustling of movement the only sound in the courtroom. The officers were still staring at her, their composure visibly shaken. Olivia met their gaze briefly, just long enough to let them know that they wouldn't get special treatment here. Then she looked toward the prosecutor. "Proceed with opening statements." Laying out the case, the prosecutor, Nathan Collins, stood and buttoned his suit jacket. He was an experienced litigator, one Olivia respected for his tenacity and sharp instincts. He strode to the center of the room, his voice even but powerful. "Your Honor, members of the court," he began, glancing toward the jury box. "This case is not about a misunderstanding. It is not about officers making a split-second decision under dangerous circumstances. This case is about two men who abused their power." He turned to face the defendants. Officers Jamison and Riley did not act out of necessity. They did not act to protect or serve. They acted because they could, because they believed they would never be held accountable, because in the past, they never were. He let the words settle before continuing. "The victim in this case, Ethan Parker, was not armed. He did not resist. He complied with every order, and yet he was thrown to the ground, handcuffed, and arrested under false charges." The jury members were listening intently, their eyes flicking between the prosecutor and the officers. Today, this court will hear testimony from witnesses. You will see the evidence. And by the end of this hearing, it will be clear that Officers Jamison and Riley are not above the law. It is time for accountability. He stepped back toward his table. "The prosecution rests for now, Your Honor." Olivia nodded. She turned to the defense attorney, Richard Keegan. "Defense, your opening statement?" Keegan stood, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, the defense acknowledges the seriousness of the allegations," he began smoothly. "However, we believe that once all the facts are presented, it will become evident that Officers Jamison and Riley acted within reason. Law enforcement officers must make difficult decisions in unpredictable situations, and we urge this court to consider the complexities of their roles before rushing to judgment." His words were carefully measured, but Olivia could already see the weaknesses in his argument. This wasn't an unpredictable situation. This wasn't about split-second decision-making. This was about abuse of power. "Thank you, counselor," she said, her tone neutral. She turned back to Nathan Collins. "Call your first witness." Testimonies that exposed the truth. The prosecution built its case methodically. Witness after witness took the stand, bystanders, legal experts, and most importantly, Ethan Parker himself. Ethan was only 22, a college student, bright-eyed and soft-spoken, still shaken by what had happened to him. He swore the oath and sat down, his fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand. Collins approached him gently. "Ethan, can you tell us what happened the night you encountered Officers Jamison and Riley?" Ethan licked his lips, his throat visibly tightening. "I was driving home from my friend's place," he began. "I stopped at a red light, and when it turned green, I drove forward. Almost immediately, I saw flashing lights behind me. And what happened next? I pulled over. I rolled down my window and asked if something was wrong." Ethan took a slow breath. But they didn't answer. One of them, Jamison, just told me to get out of the car. No explanation. "Did you resist?" Ethan shook his head quickly. "Number I did exactly what they told me. But as soon as I got out, they grabbed me, twisted my arm behind my back, and slammed me against the hood of my car. I didn't even know what was happening." A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Collins kept his voice calm. "Did they ever tell you why you were being detained?" Ethan swallowed hard. "Not until I was in the back of the cruiser. They said I was being arrested for resisting." Olivia saw Jamison shift uncomfortably in his seat. Collins stepped closer. "And were you resisting?" "No," Ethan said, his voice stronger now. "I was scared, but I never resisted." Olivia watched as the weight of Ethan's words pressed down on the room. She glanced at the officers. For the first time, they didn't look defiant. They looked cornered, like they finally realized they were being held accountable. The officer's composure begins to crack. By the time witness testimonies ended, the energy in the courtroom had shifted. The officers were no longer confident. Riley sat rigid, his jaw tight. Jameson kept glancing at Olivia as if trying to gauge her expression, searching for any sign of bias. But she gave him nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just justice. With a sharp rap of her gavel, Olivia announced, "This court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." As people began to rise from their seats, Jameson and Riley remained still. They knew tomorrow would be worse for them, and for the first time in their careers, they wouldn't be the ones in control. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as Olivia Carter took her seat behind the bench, gavel in hand. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, illuminating the polished wood of the room, but there was no warmth in the air. The tension was palpable. At the prosecution table, Ethan Daniels sat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The young man, no older than 22, had been thrust into a battle he never asked for. His story was eerily familiar to Olivia, to the onlookers in the gallery, and now to the officers who sat stiffly at the defense table. Jameson, now referred to as Officer Carter, and Riley looked distinctly different from the arrogant men who had walked into the courtroom the day before. Their shoulders were tense, their gazes downward, their previous confidence cracking under the weight of evidence and scrutiny. The prosecution was ready to deliver the final blow. Nathan Collins, sharp and composed, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Ethan Daniels to the stand." All eyes turned to Ethan. He stood hesitantly, taking slow steps toward the witness stand. Olivia watched his every move, sensing the nerves beneath his carefully controlled exterior. Ethan took the oath, his voice barely above a whisper, and then settled into the chair. Collins approached with measured steps. "Ethan," he began, his voice steady, reassuring, "can you please describe, in your own words, what happened on the night of your arrest?" Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the edges of the wooden railing. "I was driving home," he started, his voice shaking slightly. "It was late, around 10:30. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But the second I passed an intersection, I saw police lights flashing behind me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Collins nodded, allowing him a moment to collect himself. "And then, I pulled over right away, rolled down my window, hands on the steering wheel, just like you're supposed to do." A bitter chuckle escaped him, but there was no humor in it. "But before I could even ask what was wrong, the officer, Jameson, banged on my window and told me to step out of the car." Olivia could feel the gaze of the room shifting toward Jameson, now Carter, but the officer remained frozen, his face pale. Collins leaned in slightly. "And did you comply?" "Yes," Ethan said, his voice firm now. "I did everything they said. I got out. I kept my hands visible. But then Riley grabbed my wrist and twisted my arm behind my back. I didn't even know why. I asked, 'What did I do?' But they just told me to stop resisting." The phrase hung in the air. Stop resisting. The same words Olivia had heard herself. The same words used to justify force where none was needed. Collins let the silence stretch before he spoke again. "Ethan, at any point, did you resist arrest?" Ethan shook his head vehemently. "I was scared, but I wasn't resisting," he exhaled shakily. "But they already made up their minds. Jameson shoved me against the hood of the car, and Riley handcuffed me. I remember looking around, hoping someone was recording. But it was late. No witnesses this time." His voice cracked slightly. "No one to stop them." Olivia clenched her hands beneath the bench. She had been there. She knew the helplessness, the violation, the humiliation. Collins turned toward the jury. "Your Honor, we have body cam footage that corroborates Mr. Daniels' testimony," he said. "It will show the officers' use of unnecessary force, as well as their failure to state probable cause." The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They knew. They all knew. Collins turned back to Ethan. "And what happened next?" Ethan took a steadying breath. "They arrested me for resisting arrest and obstruction, just like they've done before." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and this time, Jameson and Riley couldn't look away. The officers take the stand. When Ethan stepped down, the prosecution rested their case. It was time for the defendants to testify. Officer Riley was called first. He moved with mechanical stiffness, standing before the courtroom like a man accustomed to authority. But now, that authority was being questioned. As he swore in and sat, Olivia watched his demeanor carefully. Collins wasted no time. "Officer Riley, can you explain your reasoning for detaining Ethan Daniels?" Riley cleared his throat, avoiding Olivia's gaze. "We believed he was acting suspiciously," he said. Collins arched an eyebrow. "Suspicious how?" He hesitated before pulling over. Ethan let out a disbelieving laugh from the gallery. "I hesitated for 2 seconds because I was pulling into a safe spot." "Mr. Daniels," Olivia warned, though her tone wasn't unkind. Ethan huffed, sitting back, but the damage was already done. Collins pressed forward. "Was there any indication that Mr. Daniels was a threat?" Riley shifted. "It's not always obvious in the moment. Officers have to act quickly." "Quickly enough to handcuff someone who didn't resist?" Riley opened his mouth, but no words came out. The room was silent. Collins turned toward Olivia. "No further questions, Your Honor." Olivia nodded, then turned toward the defense attorney. "Call your next witness." Officer Carter, formerly Jameson, stepped up. His face was pale, his body tense. He raised his hand to take the oath, but his movements lacked the usual confidence. Collins studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Officer Carter, given what you've heard today, do you believe you handled the arrest of Ethan Daniels correctly?" Carter hesitated. For the first time since this hearing started, he hesitated. "I believed I was following protocol," he started, but even he didn't sound convinced. Collins pressed. "Looking back, do you still believe that?" A long silence followed. Then Carter exhaled. A crack in the wall, a small, almost imperceptible shift. "I could have handled it differently," he admitted. His words settled over the courtroom like a weighted stone. Olivia didn't move, didn't react, but inside, she recognized the significance. For the first time, one of them was beginning to understand. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. The courtroom was silent as Olivia Carter took her seat behind the bench, her hands resting on the polished wood. The air was thick with anticipation, every person in the room holding their breath as they waited for the final ruling. The case against Officers Carter and Riley had been overwhelming. The testimony, the body cam footage, the history of misconduct. The prosecution had left no room for doubt. And yet, Olivia knew this moment was about more than just a verdict. It was about setting a precedent. She glanced at the officers one last time. Carter, formerly Jameson, sat rigid in his chair, jaw clenched. Riley looked pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if bracing for impact. Both men understood what was coming. Olivia took a slow breath before speaking. "This court has thoroughly reviewed the evidence and testimony provided in this hearing," she began, her voice calm but firm. "And it has become abundantly clear that Officers Carter and Riley engaged in an abuse of power that directly violated the principles of law enforcement and the trust of the community." A murmur rippled through the room, but Olivia continued without pause. "Law enforcement is not just about authority," she said, scanning the audience. "It is about responsibility, about ensuring that every individual, regardless of race, status, or circumstance, is treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. That is the foundation of justice." She turned her gaze back to the officers. "You failed in that responsibility." Carter's fingers twitched slightly, but he said nothing. Riley's face remained tense, his breathing shallow. Olivia let the words settle before delivering the sentence. "Therefore, this court rules that Officers Carter and Riley be suspended from duty, without pay, for a period of 6 months." A wave of reaction swept across the courtroom, some in shock, others in quiet satisfaction. But Olivia wasn't finished. In addition, both officers will be required to undergo extensive retraining, including de-escalation techniques and racial bias education, before any possibility of reinstatement. She let that sink in before delivering the final condition. Furthermore, both officers will be placed on a disciplinary watch list, with regular evaluations for a period of 2 years. Any further infractions, complaints, or abuse of power will result in immediate dismissal from the force. The ruling wasn't just punishment, it was accountability. A clear warning that the old way of doing things was no longer acceptable. She lifted her gavel. "This court is adjourned." The sharp crack of wood against wood echoed through the chamber. A moment of reckoning. The courtroom erupted the moment Olivia stood. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Activists whispered in satisfaction, while others grumbled that the sentence should have been harsher. Olivia expected that. No verdict could satisfy everyone. She gathered her notes, her mind already shifting to what came next. As she turned to leave, a presence lingered near the bench. Officer Carter. For a moment, he stood there, his expression unreadable. Riley had already left, practically rushing out the door, but Carter lingered, shifting from one foot to the other. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Your Honor, He hesitated, glancing around, as if unsure whether to continue. Then, finally, "I'm sorry." The words felt heavy, not just because they had been spoken, but because of who they had come from. For weeks, Carter had carried himself with the unshaken confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. But now, standing before Olivia, he looked different. Maybe for the first time, he truly understood the weight of his actions. Olivia studied him for a long moment. She had spent her career fighting for people like Ethan Daniels, fighting against systems that allowed men like Carter to walk free with no consequences. And now, here he was, finally acknowledging, however quietly, that he had been wrong. She gave a slow nod. "I hear you," she said. But she didn't offer absolution, because words weren't enough. She had spent her entire life believing that change didn't come from apologies. It came from action. Carter must have understood, because he simply nodded back before turning and walking away, disappearing into the crowd. As Olivia left the courtroom, she exhaled slowly. She had seen justice served, but she also knew this fight wasn't over. Not yet. The ruling had barely settled before the city erupted. What had started as a single case of misconduct had grown into something much larger, a movement. The morning after the verdict, Olivia Carter woke to her phone buzzing nonstop. Emails, calls, messages. Reporters wanted statements. Legal organizations wanted interviews. Community leaders wanted action. She turned on the news and saw her own face on the screen. Historic ruling. Officers held accountable in police misconduct case. Judge Carter sets precedent for law enforcement reform. Some headlines were celebratory, others were skeptical, but the common thread was clear. The system had shifted, even if just a little, and now everyone was watching. A city demanding change. The ruling ignited conversations across Cleveland. Community centers, workplaces, coffee shops, everywhere people were talking. Some were relieved. Finally, an officer had faced real consequences. Others were frustrated. They wanted more. "Suspension isn't enough," a man declared at a town hall meeting Olivia attended. "These officers have been abusing their power for years. They should have been fired." "At least this is a start," another voice countered. "How often do we even see a judge hold them accountable?" The discussions grew louder, deeper. Protests erupted, peaceful but passionate. Activists demanded stronger policies, stricter oversight. The signs they held up read, "Justice, not just promises." Accountability can't stop here. Even those who had been skeptical of Olivia's case before now saw its impact. And inside City Hall, the pressure was undeniable. The Cleveland City Council called for an emergency session on police reform. The department's use of force policies were under review, and for the first time in years, change felt real. The resistance within. Not everyone welcomed the shift. The police union fought back, arguing that the ruling set a dangerous precedent. Some officers refused to see this as a wake-up call. "We're being targeted for doing our jobs," one officer said in an interview. "This ruling is a slap in the face to law enforcement." Anonymous threats and hate messages flooded Olivia's inbox. Her security detail had to be increased after a suspicious car was seen lingering outside her home. But she refused to be intimidated. She had spent her career fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to stop now. A voice for reform. Within weeks, Olivia was invited to speak on legal panels at universities and community forums. She stood before auditoriums packed with students, activists, and aspiring lawyers, all eager to hear her perspective. At one event at Cleveland State University, she looked out into the crowd, hundreds of faces staring back, waiting. She took a slow breath before speaking. "The law is supposed to protect us all. but too often it protects some more than others. A hush fell over the room. We talk about bad apples, but what happens when the whole system shields them? She let the words settle. We can't just punish individuals. We have to change the structures that allow abuse to thrive. That's why this fight isn't about one case. It's about reform, and it's up to every single one of us to demand it. The room erupted in applause. She wasn't just a judge. She had become a symbol, and the movement was only growing. The system starts to shift. The Cleveland Police Department announced a major policy review. Implicit bias training was expanded. Body cam footage regulations were tightened. A new oversight board was created to investigate misconduct complaints. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And Olivia felt the shift. One night, after another long meeting with legal reform advocates, she stood outside City Hall looking at the skyline. Maya joined her, a tired but proud smile on her face. "You realize what you started, right?" she said. Olivia exhaled, watching the lights of the city flicker. "It's bigger than me now," she admitted. Maya nodded. "Yeah, and that's exactly why it's working." For the first time since the trial began, Olivia allowed herself to believe it. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like real change was possible. The air outside the courthouse was crisp, the early morning light casting long shadows over the marble steps. Olivia Carter stood there, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, watching as a group of young activists gathered on the plaza. Their voices were strong but steady, their signs bold but hopeful. Justice is a movement, not a moment. Change doesn't stop here. The crowd wasn't massive, but it was passionate. Students, community leaders, and local residents stood side by side, holding signs, speaking to reporters, demanding that the reforms set in motion didn't fade into empty promises. Watching them, Olivia felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. The reflection of a fight well fought. "You're a legend now, you know." Olivia turned to see Maya Thompson approaching, a smirk playing at the corner of her lips. She was holding 2 coffees, handing one over. "Am I?" Olivia mused, taking the cup. Maya gestured toward the crowd. "You started something, Olivia." Olivia looked back at the rally, at the young people who had taken up the cause without waiting for permission. She thought about where this all began. The humiliation of that arrest, the cuffs tightening around her wrists, the cold metal bench in the holding cell. She remembered the anger, the frustration of being powerless in a system she had spent her whole career defending. And then, the fight. The long nights building the case, the backlash, the threats, the courtroom battles that tested every ounce of strength she had. She had been just another case to Jameson, Officer Carter, when he arrested her that day in the park. Just another name on a fabricated report. But today, she stood on the other side of history, not as a victim, not as an attorney, not even just as a judge, but as a force for change. She let out a slow breath, turning to Maya. "I didn't start this," Olivia said. "This has been happening for a long time. I just refuse to let it keep happening in silence." Maya smiled. "Well, whatever you did, it worked." The fight continues. They watched in silence for a few moments, sipping their coffee as the rally continued. "What's next for you?" Maya asked after a beat. Olivia exhaled, tilting her head toward the sky. She had won a case. She had set a precedent. But justice wasn't a single moment. It was a continuous effort. "I'm not done," Olivia said simply. "The legal battle is over, but the fight for justice? That never stops." Maya nodded, as if she expected nothing less. "You thinking about pushing for bigger reforms?" "Something like that," Olivia mused. "There's so much work left to do, policy changes, more oversight, maybe even a push for legislative action." She turned back toward the courthouse, the building where she had fought so hard for the ruling that changed everything. "The system isn't perfect," Olivia said, more to herself than to Maya. She watched the young activists holding their signs high, refusing to be ignored. "But with enough voices," she continued, "it can be pushed toward progress." She took one last sip of her coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her. And that, she thought, was the kind of justice worth fighting for.